Hey, Facebook. Charlotte's back again. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm about to go to bed, but my head has been spinning all day with where I left off on my last video. And so I just wanted to be able to talk for a few minutes and kind of deliver us to the next step. My last video essentially talked about how animism was the very first concept of religiosity for human beings, and that developed into ancestral worship, which in turn developed into polytheism. And now I want to deliver you into how we became monotheistic, which is, the religious orthodoxy that we pretty much practice today. The majority of people either follow Christianity or Islam, both of which are monotheistic religions. But I can't explain that without actually pissing off my fellow atheists. And that's okay, because I want to believe that us non-believers have at least one thing in common, that there is no God higher than truth, right? All of us are truth seekers. All of us want to believe what is there and rectify it with the evidence. And so therefore, I have to say, whenever I read atheists make the comment that religion was created in order to control humanity, I cringe inside, because that's a misnomer, absolute falsehood. And us atheists have to be careful, because whenever we use falsehood, that's all the more that religionists are going to reject our arguments. So be careful with that stuff. Religion was not created for that reason. Religion evolved, like to talk about in my last video, for the explanation of natural phenomena. And it also evolved in order to codify moral behavior. It evolved for the sheer sake of entertainment. I mean, if you were living in a cave and you had nothing to do by nighttime, what else would you be talking about? You can record these grand stories and entertain your fellows next to the fireside. And religion also worked in that manner too. The vast majority of religiosity was not recorded. It was passed down in what we call oral tradition, and it existed in that form for a very long time before cuneiform and subsequent writing was created. And like I talked about in my last video, it also helped with creating cohesive bonds, which is what developed polytheism to begin with. It helped with what I also talked about in my video, a way of human beings kind of appealing to the faiths so that they could have more control over what it was that they were going to experience. And also as a means of identification, which also relates into the cohesive bond idea, which is self of identity, the ability to belong to a troop, sharing a mutual culture, etc., etc. So now that I've recapped that, how is it essentially that religion as an orthodoxy, as a theocracy, came to intercede in these more pure reasons for our belief? I kind of touched on my past video though I didn't really articulate it and drive home the point, is that because religion was useful as a cohesive bond, and it gave what academics call divine right to rule. It was borrowed, essentially, and so therefore it could be used in order to push forth agendas. And that's no different than it is today. I mean, for instance, take the Republican Party in America, which is notorious for claiming to be religious, right? One of its major platforms of its religiosity is pushing forth the idea of being fruitful and multiplying, the anti-abortion stance. This is the perfect example of politicians those who seek to have power using religiosity in order to get forth their own agendas. The reality is the Bible has many, many instances where God not only kills infant children and pregnant women, but also orders the killing of pregnant women. Take, for instance, the famous Psalms, where the women of Tipsah are cut open and their infant fetuses are torn out of their stomachs and dashed upon the rocks in front of their dying eyes, and the troops of God are praising their Lord for giving them the power to be able to do these things. Look at the book of Numbers, where God tells the Levite priests essentially how to give an abortion. So the idea that the Bible is pro-life is 100% bullshit. Anybody who says that absolutely has not read the scriptures. There's no doubt about it. But why? Why did they push this as a religious topic? Well, they cherry picked. They cherry picked out of the Bible what they thought that they could sell, because the real reason why Republicans want to push abortion is simple. More people equals more competition for jobs, and more competition for jobs means that employers can pay less wages and less benefits. And we know this is true because abortion was legal in the church since the beginning of the church. It was actually after the bubonic plague swept through Europe and we lost almost 60% of the population, and the first worker guilds were formed in response, where the workers could now be in a position that the feudal lords needed laborers, and they could actually use their low population in order to take back some power through collective bargaining. And the feudal lords really had no choice but to obey, because what else they're going to do? They weren't going to get off their precious asses and go farm the fields themselves. And so they ran to Pope Gregory and essentially begged him, please outlaw abortion, start pushing this be fruitful and multiply ideology. We're getting raped over here, economically. We're not holding on to our power the way we want. And Pope Gregory, sycophant to many the way he is and the way that the church remains, agreed. So, if you're a student of history, one of the first things you'll know is overpopulation is absolutely one of the worst things that can happen to human beings. The less population that we have, actually, typically the better off we are, because it's the more resources that we have for everybody, and it's the harder that it takes to divide people, because shared communal labor is what drives the intimate bonds needed in order to keep us an empathetic species. But I went off on a long tangent there. Anyways, so monotheism came about because of the development of polytheism and agriculture. As I talked about in the last video, again referencing that shit sign, polytheism is essentially all the collectives of all the little clinistic ancestral gods that were put into a divine pantheon in order to establish divine right to rule and to keep newly conquered peoples from rebelling, because now they have to fear that they would displease their ancestral gods. And that's how we got, these really big, huge pantheistic religions that are very, very common with our early empires. And over time, we develop these sedentary villages, we turn into vast empires. The number one thing that begins to keep us safe is our ability for warfare during this time. Because if you practice agriculture, you have to be able to store your food. And so you need a class that's going to be able to be ready, top military shape, in order to protect that food store and also to go grab other resources from other people. So you're creating the sense of a military class. And therefore, male labor ended up becoming vastly more important than the things that women bring to society. If you look at ancient religions, women were much more valued. Ancient man wasn't even aware that men had anything to do with creating human beings. I mean, think about the logistics of it. You can have sex before you have your period, and you don't get pregnant. You can have sex when you're in menopause. You don't get pregnant. Some women are barren. Sometimes you can only get pregnant within the very specific amount of days that you're ovulating. So human beings were copulating for a very, very long time before they could actually connect the fact that the Copulation Act had to do with pregnancy. The ancients knew that there was a little something to do with the concept of menstruation and blood. I mean, that's why we see in the Bible shit like, the blood is thine life and stuff like this. Or if you look at the Quran, you see stuff like a human being started out as a blood clot, So we had a basic understanding of it, but we certainly didn't have the science to really appreciate human development and how paternity factors into it. And the fact that we still use the word uncle is testimony to that. The word uncle is Latin, and it comes from uncle-vis, or ankle-vis, or ancestor. And the reason why is if you would have been born in very, very ancient times before we understood paternity, you don't know for sure who your father is, but you know for sure who your mother is, right? And so we regarded our uncles as our fathers. And that also helped with the very first beginning of agricultural societies, because the idea of property inheritance, every time you have a new generation and you divide the property and, the new generation inherits it, the land divides until eventually you don't even have enough land to be able to support yourself working on it, nor enough laborers. And so it made sense to primitive man to kind of practice a matrilocal sense, because the woman and her brother thus had the entire family that all worked the land, and it wasn't further divided. And patriarchy is still so rabid that a lot of people get angry when you say that history was more leaned towards matrilocal, and then they start screaming the evidence, and I could go do that. I could make a long video pointing out all these different cultures in history, blah 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 blah. But again, if you are somebody who read the Bible, this would not be a fucking surprise to you. I mean, the Jews trace their lineage through the women in their family for a reason. You can't be a Jew unless your mother was a Jew. Do you think that is in this patriarchal male god religion because that wasn't actually a phenomenon in ancient history? Come on. Anyways, so as men's labor was more important, and we began to understand that men indeed created, in part, human beings, and privatization became a thing, warfare became a thing that was important to living, heavy labor became a thing with the harvest, and specialization became a thing, etc. Women lose time in the labor market when they're pregnant and breastfeeding, and we didn't have the technology in order to even be away from the hearth for very long if we have a little one hanging off our breast or in our bellies, right? So patriarchy began to rule. And as warfare was so important, the polytheistic gods ended up some becoming more supreme. Specifically, the more supreme gods were the warrior gods. And that's why you end up, for instance, again, let's look at Christianity, with Yahweh. That is such a, let's be honest, he's a brutal bastard. This guy is a war bloodlusting freakazoid. And the reason why is because he's a god of war. If you look at the very beginning of the Bible, most atheists who've done a little bit of their homework, I already, expect them to know that pantheism is normal in the beginning part of the Bible. There's like a council of the gods in Sheol, you go meet with, right? And the very first lines of the Bible are, and now ye shall be like us. Us. What monotheism uses the word us? Now, if there was only one concept of a God, it wouldn't even have, the difference between Eloi or Elohim, etc., etc. This is proof that, that polytheism was in the beginning of Judaism. And it slowly developed. And it's just par for the course knowledge if you study religion that if you really want to understand how monotheism developed, besides looking, at the time before in ancient Egypt, Isaiah is an excellent book for reading to understand the slow development of Yahweh coming above the other gods, and essentially Asheroth, who was his female goddess, his consort, Asheroth, Ishtar, Isis. A lot of these ancient gods are just repackaged. Is slowly edited out until eventually, if you look her up in Proverbs, now she's reduced to an abstract concept such as wisdom in Proverbs 8. But yet she's still kind of acting like the Logos and still assigns feminine principles, etc., and talking as if she's the creatrix of God himself. Such long evolved stuff. But anyways, so monotheism was essentially the upholding of the warrior gods above all the other deities until eventually many of the world's religions just kind of fell away with the other deities. But they're still vastly important. We still couldn't get rid of them altogether because one God can't appeal to the diversity of humanity. And that's why keeping the concept of praying to Mother Mary was still so vastly important. The Catholics had to push that onto the Western Europeans because these matrilocal paganistic people were not about to drop everything and worship a male god after, worshiping female gods right alongside their male gods, Tara and Brigitte and Freya, etc., for so many thousands of years. So that is a crash course in the development of monotheism, putting 10,000 years of history crammed into 17 minutes. So anyways, maybe next time I'll come back and I'll talk about the divine right to rule. I think you'll find that pretty interesting. Good night, Facebook. Thanks for listening.